Hi everyone. Thanks for joining us, wherever you're joining us from. Thank you for joining us for the second of two talks today, jointly organized by the National Library Board of Singapore and the Digital Preservation Coalition, or DPC. Today, we are pleased to have Paul Wheatley, who is Head of Research and Practice at the DPC, who will be speaking to us about the future of storage for preservation. Just a bit more about the DPC. The DPC is a membership organization with members from all over the world, and it aims to help its members deliver a resilient, long-term access to digital content and services. And NLB has actually been is a proud member of the DPC since last year, 2021, and we have benefited a lot from the resources and the networking opportunities that have come with DPC membership. So we are really quite happy to be partnering with them for this two talks. Before we begin, just a bit of logistics. We will be recording this session so that it can be made available online afterwards. Please keep yourselves muted throughout the event. Also, if you have any questions, we will have a Q&A segment right after this, after the talk. So leave your questions in the Q&A tab, which if you're not familiar with where this Q&A tab is, it should be you should be seeing it near the bottom of your screen, near where the chat and raise hand buttons are. So we'll get to those questions towards at the end of the session. And finally, before I hand over the time to Paul, we just wanted to take the opportunity to quickly promote two other events that are taking place later this year. The first is iPress, which is the Digital Preservation Conference, the iPress Digital Preservation Conference, which will be happening again this year in September. iPress is the premier and longest running conference series on digital preservation, and this year it's being hosted by none other than the DPC itself. It will be held in Glasgow in Scotland from the 12th to 16th of September, and it's a hybrid conference, so it will be both on-site and online. And the theme this year is Data for All, for Good Forever. Let Digits Flourish. And it aims to invite reflection and debate on how digital preservation can support communities, ecologies, economies, and ideas so that they might flourish too. Secondly, there is the annual symposium of the Southeast Asian regional branch of the International Council on Archives, or SADICA. So this will be held this year as well in November from the 15th to 17th. And this year, the symposium is being hosted by us, by the National Archives of Singapore. And it has a theme, preservation and sustainability, two sides of the same coin. And it aims to provide a venue to raise awareness, gain new perspectives, promote discussion, and engage with questions on the intersection between the work of institutions like the archives, the environment, and sustainability. So URLs to both of these are in the chat already if you want to check them out. And actually with that, I'll hand the time over to Paul, who can begin.
Okay, thanks so much, Kevin. I'll just share my slides. Okay, hopefully that's coming through okay for everybody. And I'll get started. So thanks very much for that introduction, Kevin. It's a real pleasure and a privilege to be here to speak with you today. I'm going to talk about the future of storage for preservation. So I'm going to look back a little bit and talk about some of the technologies that we've used to store our digital data. I'm going to look at some of the requirements for those technologies that we have. I'm going to introduce a simple approach to work through the various different risks that our data might be facing while we're storing them, and what we can do to mitigate those risks. And then I'm going to look a little bit more ahead to the future and discuss a little bit around how some new technologies that are coming along might actually substantially change the way we do digital preservation. So without further ado, I'll get started. And just, I suppose, to clarify the scope of today's talk, there are a whole different range of digital preservation challenges that we have before us. And I'm just going to focus in on one particular one of them. So I'm not going to talk about finding the data we need. I'm not going to talk about preserving the meaning of the data so we can interpret our zeros and ones into something useful. I'm not going to talk about access. I'm simply going to focus on keeping the bits, keeping those binary digits, the zeros and ones, what we often talk about as being bitstream preservation. So preserving those sequences of bits, those digital files that we have. How do we store them over time and make sure we don't lose them? That's what I'm going to focus in on. So we talk about this sort of long-term preservation target. What do we mean by long-term? Well, it often depends what data we have and why we're preserving it, who we're preserving it for. Maybe it depends what kind of organization you are, what your targets are. There are certainly some, for example, in the regulatory industries where there are requirements to keep data for a particular retention period and then perhaps even delete it after that period. There are, at the other end of the scale, perhaps in the cultural heritage sector, effectively we need to preserve the data for forever. That's our aim. So we tend to use this sort of 100-year target. It really takes us beyond the sort of day-to-day, year-to-year approach that we have in a lot of modern life. For the short term, it takes us past the sort of decades period of sort of medium term, takes us into the genuine long term. So we're looking at sort of a time period that takes us beyond the lifetime of software that we're using, hardware that we're using, probably beyond the lifetime of the people that are managing all that technology as well. So it's the genuine long term. That's the target that we have. So given that long term, some of the technologies that have been developed have focused on sort of creating media that we can store data on that will actually last for very long periods of time. And an example of that, which this digital preservation community tried out a little bit, there was some uptake of, was what became known as sort of gold or archival quality CD-ROMs. So this is going back probably 10, 20 years now. There's a little bit of uptake of that kind of media. The manufacturers of that media claimed that their media would last maybe 100 years, maybe longer. But of course, CD-ROMs are now pretty much obsolete. It's rare that you'll see a computer nowadays that will have a CD-ROM drive on it. And the amount of data that you can store on a CD-ROM is, in today's terms and today's scales, seems very small. So practically and functionally, that storage media has become obsolete, regardless of the fact that it was designed to last for a very long period of time. And over the last 10 or 20 years that I've been working in digital preservation, we've seen a similar sort of technologies be announced. I've often seen quite prominent stories in the media and newspapers talking about these new technologies that have solved digital preservation problems because this media is going to last for a really long time period. Here's an example on the right. This was an announcement from 2016 of a new technology that would guarantee storage on particular new kind of material, storage media, that would solve our digital preservation problems. This quote at the bottom, proclaiming that this will secure the last evidence of our civilization. Sadly, of course, this didn't happen. Here's another example of another technology that had a little bit of interest from the digital preservation community, but wasn't really taken up at all. The M-Disc. So this was an archival version of DVD-ROM using different materials, and the manufacturers suggested that it would have a lifetime of around about 1,000 years. And of course, barely 10 years later, and DVDs are pretty much obsolete. And indeed, this is a screenshot of the wonderful little website, the Museum of Obsolete Media. So these sort of long-lived media types haven't been successful. Perhaps somewhat ironically, they've become obsolete very quickly. They've tended to be very expensive. The type of storage that they've relied on has become obsolete, and functionally they've sort of become impractical to use for various different reasons, and it hasn't really aligned with the requirements of our community. So what have we used instead of these long-lived media that have been a bit of a distraction? Well, we've actually just used the commodity storage, the cheap almost disposable storage in long-term, from a long-term viewpoint, that the rest of the IT world has used. So we've used particular hard disk drives and magnetic tape. Despite the fact that this media isn't designed to have a long lifetime, we've accepted that we have to refresh and move to new versions of the media periodically over time. So we've really followed in some ways what the rest of the IT world has done. The approach that has been used in a sort of a wider IT context has typically been to provide users with rapid access and quick access to their data stored on hard disk, often locally. And some insurance has been provided by some kind of periodic backup to magnetic tape. So there was some insurance for the data should anything go wrong with the sort of primary copy on hard disk. That hasn't really been enough for the digital preservation community. We wanted to go a bit further to ensure that our data will survive for longer. So that's what I'm going to sort of drill into a little bit more, how we view the same technologies as the wider IT world, but we've placed some more stringent requirements on that. And why is that? Well, partly because we've got that sort of long-term aim. It makes us digital preservationists quite risk averse. There's certainly been this sort of a view that if you're storing data for a very long period, then the various risks that might affect our data require a little bit more attention to address. There is I think a need to, however, be quite pragmatic. In an ideal world, we would be able to mitigate against all the risks that our data is facing, but unfortunately, digital preservation is, in my experience, never adequately resourced. We're always struggling to bring in sufficient resource to do a good job of our digital preservation. In fact, in the Digital Preservation Coalition, we talk about good practice rather than best practice. Best practice is something that we tend to see as being often unachievable given the resources that we have. So we need a sort of a more practical position. And that means there's a compromise between the risks that our data is facing and the resources we have to mitigate those risks. We can't mitigate all of the risks. There is a balance. And that's perhaps in some ways one of the biggest challenges in digital preservation. How do we get that balance right? Where do we prioritize our limited resourcing? That's a difficult question, and what I'm going to hopefully work through a little bit today in the presentation. One of the projects that we've been working on quite a bit at the DPC over the last few years has been with the nuclear industry in the UK. They have some really interesting long-term digital preservation challenges. Because they are working with nuclear materials as well, they really understand how to deal with risk. And they have this really nice term, which I've adopted as well. I find it a really useful sort of perspective on digital preservation problems, which is risk appetite. So rather than just thinking about risks as something that they're completely unacceptable, you need to remove all risk and have perfect digital preservation. It's a bit more of a pragmatic approach. It's looking at, it's trying to consider what risks you might have some appetite for. There may be risks that you have very little appetite for, but hopefully there are some risks that you can tolerate. And it's taking that perspective, that practical perspective as to what is acceptable and what isn't. So I talked about resourcing and costs a little bit there. Of course, I was talking about financial costs. The other issue that we need to consider while we're doing digital preservation is, of course, the cost to the environment, the carbon cost. We know that climate change is really significant. The evidence is there, and we need to do something about it. And increasingly in this community, we're thinking about how we can minimize our impact on the environment. So that's another consideration when we're thinking about our data storage in particular. So how do we take a risk-driven approach to our bitstream preservation? Well, primarily we need to identify the different risks that our data is facing while we're storing it. And then we need to consider which of those risks we need to put in place some kind of mitigation for, to reduce those risks to a tolerable level. To inform that, I think it's useful to, where we can, to think about what lessons learned there have been from when we've lost data before. It's often one of the best ways to learn from your mistakes. Take those lessons on board and do a better job in future. That's quite difficult to do in this case, because where there has been examples of significant data loss, the organisations involved obviously don't always want to talk about it. It can be quite an embarrassing thing to make those mistakes and lose data. But the evidence that I think we have seen suggests that, at least anecdotally, that when there has been significant data loss, it's been caused by a number of different issues at the same time. So things like having a power outage, having hardware failure, possibly human error, software bugs occurring. So the software that has been functioning perfectly well before suddenly acts in a different way, the behavior changes. And these large-scale data loss incidents often occur when there's been several of those at the same time. So I think we need to be quite realistic about the likelihood of things going wrong. This is everyday life. Things don't go as planned. We need to be realistic about that, and we need to be realistic about the impact of the risks faced when we're considering how to address these issues. So I'll talk a bit more now in detail about some of the risks that we're facing and what we can do to address those risks. And as I mentioned before, the sort of existing approach to storing data in the wider IT world hasn't really been seen as being sufficient for long-term digital preservation, even though we're using the same technologies. So we tend to go a bit further, and the sort of two key areas, the two pillars on which digital preservation storage has relied, are described here on this slide. So the first of those pillars is around data replication. So rather than just doing periodic backups, what we tend to do is replicate our data exactly to a number of copies or preservation nodes, if you will. The question often arises, how many copies should we make? There is no right or wrong answer. I know there's a right or wrong answer for any of these risks and mitigations I'm going to talk about. It really depends on the particular situation that you're in, why you're preserving the data, who you're preserving it for, and all these different contextual issues. Typically, though, like most of our members in the DPC store 3 copies of the data. Some store 2, some store more than 3, but 3 is probably about the average. So that data replication gives us redundancy by making a number of copies of our data. Alongside that, the other sort of pillar on which we rely to maintain our data over time is this approach to sort of detect and repair any issues with the data, any data loss. So we do that by performing periodic fixity checking. So that's an automated process where we can go through the data stored in each of our copies and automatically recalculate all our checksums. The checksums that we store with our data are the sort of digital fingerprints, if you will, that allow us to tell if any data has changed at all. So with an automatic process, we can instantly pick up if there's any damage to our data. And if there is, we can go back to one of our other nodes to repair that data. So that's the sort of 2 main ways that we go a bit further to ensure our data can last a bit longer into the future. Of course, there are a number of other risks as well, and I'll dip into a few of those. This isn't a comprehensive list, but this is just a few more risks to give you a flavour of the sort of things that we need to consider. So I'll go through these in turn. First one here is natural or human-made disaster. So this often equates to fire or flood that might take out the location, the sort of data center where you're storing the data. The obvious solution to that is to actually store 1 or more of your copies in different geographical locations. So I often get the question relating to that from organisations asking, well, you know, what's sufficient? How far apart do our different data nodes need to be? And there isn't a direct answer to that. There isn't a specific distance, but I think it's worth thinking about the risk profile of each of those locations. So if both of the locations used to store data are in the same city, for example, maybe just a few miles apart, maybe that's okay from some perspectives, but if they're both at sea level, where a lot of cities are pretty much just about at sea level, then they're both at risk, probably at the same risk of flood, for example. So it's worth thinking about what the risk profile might be of each of those locations, and that will give you an idea of what might be sufficient to mitigate the likely risks that will happen. I think that it's useful to think in that way. As I said, there aren't sort of right or wrong answers here. It's about thinking about what the issues are relating to your storage, what the risks are, and what's going to be an adequate mitigation for those risks. Next on the list, we've got accidental deletion, the potential of human error, someone pressing the wrong button at the wrong time, perhaps deleting a substantial amount of data. I think digital preservationists tend to agree. Most of the experts you'll talk about across the community will agree that this is perhaps the biggest threat that our digital data faces. How can we mitigate against that? Access control, limiting who has access to all the data to be able to change or write over the data, I think is important. Obviously, it may be necessary to actually delete or dispose of data from time to time, particularly if you're preserving data for a specific retention period, after which it needs to be deleted. So most modern digital preservation systems will have some kind of facility to carefully manage deletion, often using a sort of a double turnkey approach, so that more than one person has to authorize any action to delete material, and also obviously reduce the chance of accidental deletion. Maintaining an audit trail of any changes to your data over time is obviously really important as well. There are lots of reasons why you might want to alter the data. Maintaining an audit trail allows you to unpick any actions that have happened and unpick any actions that perhaps weren't supposed to happen as well. That allows you to maintain a chain of authenticity with the data that you are preserving, but also learn from anything that's gone wrong, and hopefully prevent that happening again in the future. Next on the list, malicious damage. So this is a really high profile one, particularly at the moment. There seems to be a lot of high profile hacking incidents, ransomware, and so on. Cybersecurity facilities are going to be really important in hopefully limiting the impact of that. I think we can also look at designing a storage architecture that perhaps places some of our storage under different management regimes, which makes it harder for an intruder into your system to be able to actually access all the data. Even having an air gap to one of your storage nodes, this idea of having some data that isn't actually accessible online isn't always easy to manage in a very online and connected world, but there may be ways of doing that. And I'll return to those two ideas a little bit more towards the end of the presentation. Common mode failure is this idea of a single sort of technological fault that might affect every node of your storage. So perhaps if your 3 different nodes of storage all use the same storage hardware, a manufacturing fault could have an impact on all 3 nodes at the same time. Perhaps if there's some common software used across your 3 nodes, then a bug could affect all 3 copies in theory. So there's this idea of having some diversity across your different storage nodes that will reduce the likelihood of that happening. And then finally, quite a different kind of risk here. There's the risk that however well you might plan and implement initially different mitigations to address some of the risks that I've talked about, there's danger that those mitigations don't continue effectively over time. So I think it's important to have a really clear management layer that will ensure that those mitigations are implemented. So that means having clear policy and procedures around these kind of mitigations, having clear reporting channels and escalation channels, so if anything goes wrong, managers will be alerted of this, and they can step in and take action if necessary. And ideally, some kind of independent audit and verification of the processes that are in place and the mitigation that's in place is really useful. And I've been involved in doing audits of a number of DPC members, and that's often picked up issues around in this area. It's been quite useful to have that outside view for a particular organisation. So if you want to go ahead and sort of apply this risk-based approach to your digital preservation architecture and assess what risks you need to be concerned about, and perhaps what you might be able to do to address those risks, I would recommend a very simple and straightforward risk assessment process. And it's the kind of risk assessment process you might use in lots of other different project management sort of areas. What I would suggest is you work through and identify the different risks that are relevant to your situation, and then look to give a score to each of those risks. So the simple way of doing that is to score the likelihood and the impact of those risks occurring, multiply those together, think about what mitigation you have in place that will reduce that score, and that will give you sort of a final risk score, and that you might give it a score out of 10, or perhaps just a high, medium, or low, just to give you an overall impression of what the outstanding risk is in that area. This process is really quick and easy to apply. It'll allow you hopefully to identify any gaps in your mitigation, and allow you to consider, as I sort of described before, that the appetite you might have or might not have for any of the remaining risk that's there following the mitigation that you've got in place. It also works quite nicely to allow you to document your preservation approach here. So that tends to be general good practice in digital preservation, to document what you are doing. It can act as a very nice, very useful communication tool for others to show why you are going the extra mile to make this, to hopefully keep this data for longer periods, and to show why it's important that this extra resource is being expended in this area. And it can also be a useful advocacy tool. So if you do need to push forward with further mitigation in a particular area, then this gives you some of the evidence to make the case, perhaps to senior management, for additional resource to provide further mitigation. So that can be quite a simple, straightforward, but useful approach to make sure that you're using the right approach, and what approach that's suitable for your particular situation. So I'm going to move on and think a little bit more broadly about the sort of changes in technology that are affecting how we're storing our data over time. And one of the big changes that's come in over the last 10 years or so has been cloud storage. So there's been this really rapid growth in IT outsourcing that I think has surprised everyone in the digital preservation world. And I kind of think back to when I first started working in this field 25 years ago, and if someone had asked me, would most of the organizations in this field be trusting commercial companies to store data for them off-site, I probably would have laughed. I would have been really shocked at that approach. But cloud storage has come in, this idea of organizations outsourcing their IT has really become really common, and it's started to substantially change the way organizations are storing their data for the long term as well. And I never would have suspected that going back just a few years. So the changes happened really quite quickly. So I suppose firstly, what do I mean by cloud storage? It's really using exactly the same technologies, often hard disk and magnetic tape, but rather than storing on site, on premise, you're outsourcing that storage to a third party who is going to store the data for you in a data center in another location. I suppose there are some examples where digital preservationists have actively pursued cloud storage because it does offer some advantages. I think in many cases, digital preservationists have been a little bit forced into outsourcing storage using cloud because their organization as a whole has been outsourcing their IT. So there's different reasons why cloud has become quite popular quite quickly. Cloud does offer some advantages, as I said. It can offer real diversity in terms of storage technology and the sort of management regime it's under, and having that diversity can be really useful, as I said earlier, to help us mitigate some of those different risks that are present. It can really easily introduce geographical separation of different copies of data that you're storing, particularly if you're storing one copy of data on site and perhaps one or more in cloud storage. There's certainly an element of convenience involved with cloud storage. Managing storage hardware is a considerable amount of work, particularly refreshing data from iteration to iteration of magnetic tape or hard disk is a considerable amount of work to get right, and so there's some potential for a convenience there. There could be some economies of scale in storing your data in a large data center rather than just doing it yourself. I'm not sure it necessarily makes it cheaper. The commercial aspect means that the cost is still going to be there, around about the same, possibly a little bit more. There is, from the environmental angle, I think there's some hope of optimism there. We're gradually seeing more transparency around use of electricity and reporting on that to give a real impression of what the impact is on the environment, and I think that's gradually increasing. We're getting more insight into that, which is quite useful. So we have those advantages, but how much preservation responsibility can we safely outsource? The question is there really as to how much of this we can do. The classic example of this is around fixture checking of our data. So most cloud providers will perform fixture checking of some kind. There's very little reporting on that as to how frequently the data is being fixture checked and what happens if any data is damaged. These things are often a little bit obscured. So I think there are many questions still to be resolved as to how the digital preservation community effectively uses cloud storage. I see our members using it in different ways. Some members will use just one cloud storage provider to store several copies of their data. Other organizations are actually using different cloud storage providers. So they're introducing more resilience and less dependence on a single provider. Some organizations are actually doing some fixture checking themselves. Some are trusting the cloud storage providers. So I don't think we've really worked through all those issues around trust and risk there. And that's something that I think we need to get on top of as we move forward. I think we're still in that sort of explorative phase. So looking further ahead, are there any technologies that are likely to change the way that we do digital preservation even further? I think cloud storage has had quite a dramatic effect. It's still kind of happening, but what's going to happen in the future? I talked early on in the presentation about media types that have been designed to last very long periods of time, and they're not really fitting with our requirements, and they're actually becoming obsolete quite quickly. There's one technology which seems to be an exception to that, and that's storing our data as DNA data storage. We're looking to encode our data in synthesized DNA. So this has been a concept that's been talked about for many years. It's actually a tried and tested process. The main issue with that is that it's actually still very costly to use. But there's a huge amount of research and development that is going into improving the efficiency of synthesizing DNA for this purpose, and the costs are rapidly coming down. And the current thinking is that it may be just 4 or 5 years until this technology becomes possible to use at a sort of a cost level that might be acceptable to our community. So in some ways it does seem a bit of a sci-fi technology, but it's actually just appears to be just around the corner. other than the cost, there are a few different challenges. I think that one of the other main ones of using DNA is that it's a write once technology. Once you've written your data to DNA, you can't change it. And that doesn't necessarily fit well with digital preservation requirements. Often we want to gradually manage and change our data over time, particularly metadata. We want to keep updating that, refreshing it, and making it better over time. So this idea of writing your data and then not being able to change it possibly for a long time period doesn't fit that well with the way we want to work. So there are some issues to think about there. But there are some significant benefits of DNA data storage. So I mentioned this concept of the air gap, of storing some of your data in a way that isn't accessible from online, that would stop anyone from, stop any hackers, for instance, from possibly damaging your data, prevent a kind of ransomware attack. Well, DNA will be perfect for that. So your data ends up in a canister sat on your desk. There's certainly a good air gap there. Another advantage is that if you're writing data to DNA, if you write one copy of your data, it's actually very cheap to produce a number of other copies of data as well. So that instantly gives you a lot more resilience. You'll be able to store those copies, perhaps even in different locations around the world, at very low cost. The financial costs associated with DNA data storage, they're associated with the writing and the reading parts, not the actual storage. So once you've written the data to DNA, you have some inert material in a canister. The storage cost is effectively zero from year to year. The storage industry uses the term total cost of ownership. So over a long time period, let's say you're storing the data for 100 years, the total cost of ownership, even if that cost of writing is reasonably expensive, over a long period, this would be a very attractive TCO. So that's very attractive from a digital preservation point of view. Obviously, we have limited resource and being able to store in a very efficient way from a cost point of view, but also from an environmental point of view, the carbon cost is likely to be very low over the long term. So that's some quite attractive benefits there, even though DNA data storage works in a different way to the way we're used to using storage. So how could DNA actually fit into our digital preservation requirements? Well, I could imagine DNA will be ideal as what you might call the third copy. So if we're storing 3 copies of our data, perhaps we want 1 copy on site, on hard disk. We can get to it easily. We can easily use it. We can monitor it. We can make use of it. We can assess it. We can characterize it. All the things that we want to do for digital preservation, we can provide access to it. That's a sort of convenient copy, our nearline copy. We have a second copy, perhaps that could be in cloud storage in a different geographical location, which gives lots of diversity in the way we're managing that data and mitigate a number of those risks. And then our third copy perhaps could be stored on DNA, which, as I said, over the long term could be quite efficient way of storing the data, and again, gives us more resilience. So this is all speculation now, but perhaps this is the way we might be able to adopt this technology in the future and make use of it in our community. So if you'd like to know more about DNA storage, the DNA Data Storage Alliance is a great place to go to for more information. This is a sort of an industry group that's coming together to work out how to take forward this technology in a useful way. So DPC is a member. We're looking at things like standardization to make sure that data written to DNA can be easily read back by other people using different technology in the future without any kind of issues. So we're looking at those sort of activities that are essential to make this a useful and reliable technology for us in the future. And if you want to know more, Kevin mentioned the iPress conference that's coming up in September. There's going to be a range of different talks at the conference relating to DNA, including a presentation from one of our members who's been involved in a trial of writing data to DNA and reading it back again. And there'll also be a panel discussion involving some of the technologists involved and also some digital preservation experts as well. It's a panel session I'm going to be moderating, so please bring along your questions to that panel session. It would be great to see you there and get you involved in that. So I'm just heading towards the end of my presentation now. I'll just reference a few of the things that might be useful for you. And here's a few DPC resources that have some relevance to the things that I've talked about today. If you were here for the presentation yesterday, you would have heard Sharon and Amy mention the DPC rapid assessment model. So this is a maturity model that helps you work out, assess the sort of level of your digital preservation capability, and helps you to think about how you'd like to develop that capability and what kind of level you'd like to take it to. A key element of that, represented by one of the 13 criteria in the model, is around bitstream preservation. So very much focused on the things that I've been talking about today. DPC RAM is really quick to use. It's a really good starting point if you want to move on with your digital preservation and develop things further. So that's a really good starting point if you want to consider some of these issues a bit more. Quite a few of the things I've talked about have involved, particularly around cloud storage and around relate to procurement. This is becoming an increasing challenge in our community because we're outsourcing a lot more preservation work. DPC has a procurement toolkit, that one members only, I'm afraid, that will help you work through the process of procuring third-party services. An element of that toolkit we've just launched, we've just sort of launched a version 2 of it in the last couple of months. And an element of that toolkit that is on open access is our core requirements for a preservation system. So this is quite useful to be used as a communication tool to get across the sort of more stringent requirements that the digital preservation community has for preservation and data storage and those kind of things. So quite a useful tool if you're perhaps talking to your IT department or other people within your organization as to why digital preservation needs to go a little bit further than the standard use of IT storage. And then finally, shortly we'll be releasing a DPC Technology Watch guidance note on the topic that I've talked about today on bitstream preservation, and that will help to take you through this sort of risk-based approach to digital preservation storage. So just a quick mention for the DPC. I think digital preservation is a really difficult challenge for anyone to take on their own, for any organisation to take on their own. But as a community, we've shown we can solve all those problems together. So if you're not a member, we'd really love to have you on board. Please check out the link, and it would be great to have you as a member of the DPC. We are very much stronger together. And the DPC has an office in, as well as an office in the UK where I'm based. It has an office in Australia pretty much on your time zone, and that office supports a whole load of different things that are going on in that part of the world, including the Australasia Preserves group. And they have the next event that's coming up is described here on preservation framework strategies and policies. So I'll just give a little trailer for that, and the link for that event should be in the chat just coming up now. And at that point, I think we've got a few minutes left for questions, so I'll pass back to Kevin, and it would be great to have a further conversation with you if you've got some questions for us.
Yes. If you have any questions, feel free to put them into the Q&A tab. We have one question already. What do you think about leapfrog approach for preservation storage? I've seen preservation of VHS tape to CD just to witness the quick obsolescence journey of CDs.
Sure. I mean, this is the challenge if the sort of long-lived media that I talked about isn't going to work for us. It's going to be expensive. It's going to be impractical. Then we are, to an extent, committed to this idea of refreshing our storage from medium to medium. I think one of the lessons that we have learned is that handheld media such as CD-ROMs and DVD and often a lot of the optical storage media are not very helpful to us. They quickly become obsolete. We quickly move on. I think the way we're using technology is changing. Cloud storage is coming in. Everything is online. So we're already moving away from handheld media. So I think that will become less of an issue as we go anyway. But to an extent, yes, if we're using cloud, that still means we're storing data to hard disk and to tape, and there needs to be refreshment there. Moving from different versions of LTO tape to the next version, those sort of migrations are involve an awful lot of work, and that's something we can't really get around. Obviously, the process of how we do those migrations is important, making sure that we don't lose data during those migrations, having careful plans in place to do that. Can we trust our cloud storage providers to do that well for us is the big question that I raised, and that's something certainly that the community will need to think about. What will happen if a cloud storage provider loses some data stored by someone in the digital preservation community? I'm sure that will have a significant impact. Will that reverse this sort of rush to cloud storage? I don't know, but there's certainly questions to be answered there. Something we need to think about around the sort of risk and trust issues.
We have another question. What do you think about the relationship between the digital preservation community and commercial innovation, how this has evolved over time? Do you think our interests have been converging with more people concerned with long-term accessibility, flexibility checks, and so on?
Wow, that's a really good question. That sounds like the kind of question that needs a whole presentation, maybe a whole DPC briefing day for people to discuss that. That's a really good one. Yeah, so I mean, that instantly makes me think of a few different things. I mean, from a very much a digital preservation community point of view, I think when we started off looking at how to solve the problems of digital preservation, we were very much thinking about open source. We were thinking about developing the technology to do that ourselves. We had some success with that, but actually the last sort of decade or so, we've seen commercial providers come in and develop commercial off-the-shelf digital preservation solutions that have really pushed us forward quite quickly at doing an amazing job. There are still some challenges there, but that innovation, I think, has really taken us forward in the digital preservation world. So the commercial world from that angle has been incredibly useful to us. From a broader perspective, I mean, just looking at the Digital Preservation Coalition, it was founded 20 years ago. So the iPress conference is in some ways for us a celebration, an anniversary of the DPC. It was founded, the DPC, by memory institutions within the UK. Very much the sort of national libraries, archives, universities were at the forefront of digital preservation at that point. But that has changed considerably over the last 2 decades, as well as the DPC going international and not being UK focused anymore. We've seen a real diversity in the range of different organisations that have wanted to join the DPC. It's really broken out quite quickly from beyond that sort of memory institution to all sorts of commercial sectors. So we have really good representation from international banks, from manufacturing, from regulatory industries. I mentioned the nuclear industry. So that's really changing substantially, and there's still a long way to go. But I think that shows that actually the digital preservation challenges we're talking about aren't purely related to research and cultural heritage. They're related to just managing data that is really important to most organizations around the world, whatever purpose they have for existing. Yeah, the commercial world is having a big impact. I think part of the question was, is there sort of convergence? And I suppose the other angle is related to the IT technology we use, the operating system we use to do our everyday computing, but also to do our digital preservation. are we seeing digital preservation moving into general IT? I mean, it would be great if we saw uptake of things like clear manifests and checksums. I don't think we're quite seeing it there. There are a few examples of that happening, but in the wider sort of IT world, we aren't really seeing that convergence yet. I think there has been some effort to engage some of the big vendors out there, the sort of Microsofts and Adobes and so on. We're having some progress in doing that, talking to Google about Google Docs and the sort of huge preservation challenges that exist there. It's very much early days, but I think we are starting to have a bit of an impact there, and I think I certainly see a role there for the DPC in future around that sort of broader advocacy around engaging the wider IT world, and hopefully getting them to make a few. There probably only needs to be fairly small adjustments that would really help us do our digital preservation job. So there's a few thoughts, but as I say, I think that's a great idea for a bigger event. Maybe we can have a think about that for the future. Great question.
Yeah, and also I think we have a lot of information that's stuck in platforms now, if we're talking about the cloud, and whether there's any potential convergence between those platforms and storage. If they are stuck in platforms, then what do we do with the information in those platforms, whether we can maintain them there or something. We have two related questions about checksums, so I'll try to combine them. Do you have any advice on how to deal with checksums that don't match? And also, do you have any thoughts on checksums as a means of establishing fixity versus, say, looking at file sizes, where there's perhaps less of a chance of like false alarms? Yeah.
Okay, so checksums that don't match, it depends on the exact situation, really. Difficult to sort of answer that without knowing more. I always joke with my colleagues that the answer to any digital preservation question is it depends. The first thing that happens when one of my members asks me a question is I ask them about five or six more questions back to find out the context of the problem involved. So maybe that's something that we could pick up offline. There is a DPC technology watch report. Maybe while I talk, I can find the link. I might not be able to do that at the same time. There is a technology watch report on checksums that can help you work through some of the issues around which checksums to use and how to apply them. So that might be a good location to go to answer some of those questions. I'm not sure I've answered the question very well, but I'll see if I can dig out that link while we're talking. Any other questions, Kevin? Or is it,
there was a question about pickle film and whether it's considered a new technology. Have you heard of pickle film?
I'm not very familiar with pickle. Is there a follow-up on that? Is there a particular question around that?
We have a couple of questions. We have a couple of raised hands. I don't know if maybe we have time to take one of them. We could try. If you would like to, I mean, I could let you speak. maybe let's try that.
Yeah. Thank you.
Leonardo, did you have a question that you wanted to raise, or? Okay. If not, you can post it in the Q&A tab. We do have another question coming in from the Q&A tab that's about blockchain.
About preserving blockchain. That's a really good question. That's quite a hard one to answer in a short space of time. There was an event quite recently, I think, that was actually looking into some of the challenges around preserving blockchain. That's probably another one I could follow up on and send you a link to. I think there was a recording of that. Yeah, we might be hedge as a blockchain if you've got a resource that actually depends on the blockchain rather than just a sort of a reference to a blockchain, something like an NFT. Then that gets quite hard quite quickly. Probably an emulation approach could be used. Yeah, there's huge challenges wrapped up in that simple question. I don't think there are easy answers to that, I'm afraid. I did post a link in the chat to the Checksums Technology Watch guidance note, which might be of useful for those questions on that topic.
Okay, I'm just mindful of the time. I think, unfortunately, we have run out of it. So we're going to have to call it an end there. Sorry if we couldn't get to all of your questions. Just before
I should say, Kevin, just sorry to interrupt, but if anyone has any further questions, my contact details are on the screen, so please drop me a line. I'm very happy to follow up with you offline. And if I wasn't able to answer your question in detail, that's no problem. Let's have a chat about it offline.
And we'll be circulating these slides as well.